The small town of Cedar Falls had one unspoken rule: avoid Dan Morrison at all costs. At 6'8", with hands like sledgehammers and a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face, the former Marine turned devout Mormon was everything the locals feared in one imposing package. Children crossed streets when they saw him coming. Women clutched their purses tighter. Even the church elders whispered behind closed doors about the giant who sat alone in the back pew every Sunday. But what they didn't know was that Dan's massive frame housed the heart of a poet. Behind his fortress of muscle and silence lived a man who rescued injured birds, wrote letters to lonely elderly neighbors, and cried during old movies when no one was watching. Years of battlefield trauma and religious guilt had taught him to hide his tenderness behind walls of steel, believing the world was safer when he appeared dangerous. Then Elsa arrived in town, a fearless librarian with eyes that saw through facades and a spirit that refused to judge books by their covers. She would become the first person to crack his armor, but could she handle the gentle giant he truly was inside? The morning Elsa Chen first encountered Dan Morrison, she was wrestling with a particularly stubborn box of donated books outside the Cedar Falls Public Library. The October wind whipped her dark hair across her face as she tugged at the cardboard corners, muttering colorful words that would have made her grandmother blush. "Need some help with that?" The voice rumbled like distant thunder, causing Elsa to look up into the darkest brown eyes she'd ever seen. They belonged to a man so tall she had to crane her neck to meet his gaze. Everything about him screamed danger: the military posture, the hands that could probably crush walnuts, the way he seemed to take up all the available oxygen on the sidewalk. Most people would have stammered out a polite refusal and backed away. Elsa, however, had never been most people. "That would be amazing, actually. I think this box is plotting against me." She stepped aside, brushing dust from her burgundy cardigan. "I'm Elsa, the new librarian. Well, technically I've been here 3 weeks, but in small town time that still counts as new, right?" Something flickered across his features, surprise, maybe even amusement, before the stone mask slipped back into place. Dan Morrison. He lifted the box as if it weighed nothing, which, considering Elsa had been fighting with it for 10 minutes, seemed borderline supernatural. "Where do you want this?" "Just inside the front door would be perfect." She hurried ahead to hold the door open, studying his profile as he passed. There was something almost careful about the way he moved, as if he was constantly aware of his size and trying to minimize it. "Thank you so much. I was starting to think I'd have to unpack it right there on the sidewalk." Dan set the box down with the same precision she'd seen him use straightening hymnals after Sunday service. "Books are heavy," he said simply. "The irony of a librarian who can't lift book boxes isn't lost on me." Elsa laughed, a sound that seemed to catch him off guard. "I don't suppose you're looking for part-time work? I could use someone with actual upper body strength around here." The offer hung in the air between them, and Elsa watched as several emotions played across his face. He glanced around the library's interior, taking in the high shelves, the reading nooks, the peaceful quiet that permeated the space. "I don't think that's a good idea," he said finally. "Why not? Do you have something against books?" "No, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "People don't usually want me around." The admission was quiet, matter of fact, and it hit Elsa like a physical blow. She'd noticed the way conversations died when he entered rooms, how mothers pulled their children closer on the rare occasions their paths crossed. It was ridiculous. Intimidating, yes, but there was nothing in his demeanor that suggested actual threat. "Well, I'm not most people," she said, echoing her earlier thought. "The position's open-ended, flexible hours, and the pay is terrible, but the company's exceptional. Think about it." For the first time since she'd arrived in Cedar Falls, Dan Morrison almost smiled. Almost. "I should go," but he hesitated at the door, turning back. "Thanks for not running away." "Why would I run away?" He studied her for a long moment, as if trying to solve a puzzle. "Most people do." After he left, Elsa stood in the doorway watching his retreating figure. He walked with purpose but without haste, and she noticed how he stepped aside for an elderly woman coming down the sidewalk, pressing himself against a storefront to give her plenty of room. The woman hurried past without acknowledgement, clutching her purse exactly as predicted. "Idiots," Elsa muttered, then turned back to her books with new determination. Cedar Falls was about to learn that their new librarian had never met a misunderstood soul she couldn't reach. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Ezra Grimm made his way to Henderson's hardware store, his boots echoing against the cracked sidewalk. At 6'8", he couldn't help but loom over the scattered pedestrians who quickly crossed to the other side of the street when they spotted him approaching. He'd grown accustomed to the whispers that followed in his wake, the hurried phone calls warning friends and neighbors of his whereabouts. The brass bell above the hardware store door chimed his arrival, and old Pete Henderson looked up from his inventory clipboard with barely concealed dread. 3 other customers in the store suddenly found urgent business elsewhere, filing past Ezra without making eye contact. "Need a new deadbolt," Ezra said simply, his deep voice rumbling in the suddenly quiet space. "Someone broke mine last night." Pete's weathered hands trembled slightly as he gestured toward the back wall. "Hardware's back there, help yourself." As Ezra examined the selection of locks, he caught fragments of Pete's hushed phone conversation behind the counter. "Yeah, he's here now, said someone broke his lock. I'm telling you, Martha, something ain't right about that whole situation." 20 minutes later, Ezra emerged from the store with his purchase, only to find Deputy Collins leaning against a patrol car parked directly in front. The young officer straightened when he spotted Ezra, his hand instinctively moving toward his radio. "Morning, Mr. Grimm. Heard you had some trouble at your place last night. Nothing I can't handle. Maybe you should file a report. Breaking and entering is serious business." Ezra almost smiled at the irony. The same people who'd likely thrown the rocks through his windows were now being protected by their concern for proper legal procedures. "Appreciate the offer, Deputy, but I'll manage." As he walked away, Ezra could hear Collins calling in his location and status as if he were tracking a dangerous animal through the neighborhood. The grocery store proved even more challenging. Ezra had barely made it past the produce section when he noticed the pattern: shoppers abandoning their carts mid-aisle, mothers pulling their children closer, elderly customers suddenly remembering urgent appointments elsewhere. By the time he reached the checkout lane, the store was nearly empty. Teenage cashier Emma Valdez tried to maintain her composure, but her hands shook as she scanned his items. Canned goods, bread, milk, the simple necessities of a man living alone. Nothing threatening about any of it, yet she flinched each time their eyes met. "That'll be $37.50, she whispered. Ezra handed her exact change, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you, miss." Outside, he loaded his groceries into the bed of his battered pickup truck, acutely aware of the small crowd that had gathered across the street. Mrs. Patterson stood among them, her arms crossed and her expression stern as she held court with her fellow concerned citizens. Their voices carried on the morning breeze. "I'm telling you, there's something off about him. Men don't just up and leave the church for no reason. My sister heard from someone in Salt Lake that there was an incident, something involving a woman. Well, I heard he got violent with the church elders. That's why they sent him packing." Ezra's jaw tightened as he slammed the tailgate shut. Each rumor stung more than the last, not because they questioned his character, but because they painted his faith community in such an unforgiving light. The truth was far more complicated and infinitely more painful than any of their wild speculations. He climbed into his truck and turned the key, but the engine only wheezed and clicked in response. 3 more attempts yielded the same result. Perfect. Now he was stranded in the middle of town with an audience of hostile neighbors documenting his every move. As he popped the hood and leaned over the engine, Ezra heard footsteps approaching on the sidewalk. He tensed, expecting another confrontation or perhaps Deputy Collins returning with backup. Instead, a gentle voice broke through his concentration. "Alternator trouble." He straightened and turned to find a woman standing a respectful distance away. her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and her clothes bearing the telltale stains of someone who worked with her hands. Unlike everyone else in town, she wasn't looking at him with fear or suspicion. Her brown eyes held only genuine curiosity and perhaps a touch of sympathy. Could be, he admitted, surprised by her direct approach, or the starters finally giving up. "I'm handy with engines, if you'd like a second opinion." Across the street, the crowd of onlookers had grown larger, their voices rising with excitement at this unexpected development. Ezra glanced at the woman again, taking in her calm demeanor and the calluses on her hands that spoke of honest work. "I wouldn't want to impose," he said carefully. She smiled then, and something loosened in his chest that had been wound tight for months. "No imposition at all. I'm Lily Santos, and I believe in helping neighbors." The Moonbeam Diner buzzed with its usual Tuesday morning energy when Clara pushed through the glass doors, the familiar jingle of bells announcing her arrival. She'd been coming here since she was 16, first as a rebellious teenager sneaking coffee before school, then as a college student cramming for finals, and now as the town librarian seeking refuge from another sleepless night spent wondering about mysterious giants who fixed fences in the dark. "The usual, honey?" Dolores called from behind the counter, her beehive hairdo defying both gravity and the decade. "Please." Clara slid into her favorite booth by the window, the cracked vinyl seat greeting her like an old friend. Outside, Main Street was waking up slowly, shop owners unlocking doors and flipping signs from closed to open. The coffee arrived steaming hot, accompanied by Dolores's knowing smile. "You look like you wrestled with your pillow all night and lost." Before Clara could respond, the diner's comfortable chatter died as if someone had flipped a switch. She looked up to see every head turned toward the entrance, where Ezra stood frozen in the doorway like a deer caught in headlights. His massive frame filled the space completely, and Clara could practically feel the collective intake of breath from the other patrons. For a moment that stretched like taffy, nobody moved. Then the whispers started. "What's he doing here?" Thought he kept to himself. "Dolores better keep an eye on the register." Clara watched Ezra's jaw tighten, saw his hands clench and unclench at his sides. He was wearing the same worn jeans and flannel shirt from yesterday, his dark hair slightly damp as if he'd just showered. There was something achingly vulnerable about the way he stood there, clearly regretting his decision to venture into town but too proud to simply turn around and leave. Without thinking, Clara raised her hand and waved. "Ezra, over here!" The entire diner swiveled to stare at her, as if she'd just announced her intention to juggle flaming torches. Ezra's startled gaze found hers across the room, and she patted the seat across from her with what she hoped was an encouraging smile. He hesitated for what felt like an eternity before slowly making his way over, his boots heavy on the checkered linoleum. The booth creaked ominously as he folded his considerable length into the seat, his knees bumping the table and causing her coffee to slosh. "Sorry," he mumbled, his voice barely above a whisper. "Don't be." Clara leaned forward, lowering her voice to match his. "Brave of you to come in here. This place is like the town's unofficial gossip headquarters." A ghost of a smile flickered across his features. "I noticed." Dolores approached their table with all the enthusiasm of someone walking toward a live grenade. "What can I get you?" she asked Ezra, her tone carefully neutral. "Just coffee, please." "We have pancakes," Clara suggested. "Dolores makes them the size of dinner plates. You look like you could use a good breakfast." "I don't want to be any trouble. The only trouble you'll be is if you don't eat something. You're so thin I'm worried a strong wind might blow you away." This earned her an actual smile, transforming his entire face. "I'm hardly thin. Tall doesn't equal fed. Trust me, I'm a librarian. I know these things." Dolores shifted uncomfortably. "So, pancakes? Please," Ezra said. "And thank you." As the waitress hurried away, Clara studied the man across from her. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, the slight scar on his chin, the way his shoulders curved inward as if he was trying to make himself smaller. "You fixed my fence." It wasn't a question, and he didn't try to deny it. The post was rotting. It would have fallen in the next strong storm. How did you know? I walk sometimes. At night. I noticed it leaning. That was incredibly kind of you. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. Anyone would have done it. But they didn't. You did. She wrapped her hands around her coffee mug, using the warmth to steady herself. People in this town, they've made up their minds about you without really knowing you, haven't they? His laugh was bitter. Can you blame them? Look at me. I am looking at you. I see someone who fixes strangers' fences and says please and thank you and tries to make himself smaller so others feel more comfortable. She paused as Dolores returned with a stack of pancakes that could have fed a small army. I see someone who's been hurt and decided it was easier to be alone than risk being hurt again. Ezra stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his dark eyes. Around them, the diner gradually returned to its normal volume, though Clara could still feel curious glances being thrown their way. You don't know anything about me, he said quietly, but there was no anger in it. Then tell me. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Sarah made her way to work, her mind still replaying yesterday's encounter at the library. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning as she tried to reconcile the gentle giant who'd spoken so softly about books with the fearsome reputation that preceded him everywhere in town. Lost in thought, she nearly collided with Mrs. Henderson outside the post office. Sarah, dear. The elderly woman clutched her arm with surprising strength. I heard the most disturbing news. Betty Krause said she saw you talking to that Delacroix man yesterday. Please tell me it isn't true. Sarah's cheeks warmed. I was just helping a library patron, Mrs. Henderson. That man is dangerous, sweetheart. You mark my words. Mrs. Henderson's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. My nephew works at the lumber yard, where he used to be employed. Said Elijah could split logs with his bare hands and never spoke a word to anyone. Unnatural, if you ask me. Before Sarah could respond, Mrs. Henderson hurried away, leaving her standing alone with a growing sense of unease. Not about Elijah, but about the town's treatment of him. The library felt different when she unlocked the doors that morning. Every shadow seemed to hold the possibility that he might return, and she found herself both hoping for and dreading another encounter. She went about her routine mechanically, checking returns, organizing the children's section, and trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach whenever the front door chimed. By noon, she'd convinced herself he wouldn't come back. Perhaps their conversation had been too forward, too personal. Maybe she'd misread his longing for connection. Then, just after lunch, she heard it. The careful, measured footsteps that seemed to apologize for their very existence. She looked up from her desk to find Elijah hovering near the entrance, clutching a worn paperback. I finished it, he said simply, holding up the book. Sarah's face broke into a genuine smile. Already? What did you think? He approached the desk slowly, as if afraid sudden movements might startle her away. It was beautiful. Sad, but beautiful. The way Steinbeck writes about people, even when they're broken, he makes you see their dignity. The observation caught her off guard. She'd expected a simple "it was good" or "I liked it." Instead, he'd captured something essential about the author's compassion that many readers missed entirely. You have excellent instincts, she said, then immediately worried she sounded condescending. But Elijah's face brightened slightly. My mother always said reading was like visiting other people's souls. I never understood what she meant until I started reading literature instead of just technical manuals. Sarah leaned forward, intrigued. What kind of technical manuals? Engineering, mostly. Construction. I have a degree in civil engineering from BYU. He said it matter-of-factly, but Sarah detected a note of old pride mixed with current shame. That's impressive. Are you working in the field now? His face shuttered, closed like a book slamming shut. No, that's not possible anymore. The pain in his voice was so raw that Sarah instinctively reached out, almost touching his hand before catching herself. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to pry. You weren't. It's just, he struggled with the words. When you look like I do, and when people believe certain things about you, career options become limited. Sarah felt a flash of anger on his behalf. What kind of things do people believe? Elijah's laugh was hollow. That I'm violent, unstable, a threat to decent society. Pick your favorite rumor, I've probably heard it. And are any of them true? The question hung in the air between them. Elijah's eyes searched her face, looking for judgment, for fear, for the inevitable moment when she'd realize her mistake in showing him kindness. I've never hurt anyone, he said quietly. The closest I've come to violence is swatting mosquitoes, but I understand why people assume otherwise. Sarah studied his face, the sharp angles, the intense dark eyes, the scar that cut across his left eyebrow. Yes, he looked intimidating, but there was something else there, something she was beginning to recognize, the careful posture of someone who'd learned to make himself smaller in a world that found his very existence threatening. Would you like another book recommendation? She asked. Relief flooded his features, very much. As she led him through the stacks, explaining the merits of various authors, Sarah noticed how he moved, always careful not to brush against her, always maintaining a respectful distance, always positioning himself so she had a clear path to the exit. These weren't the behaviors of a dangerous man. They were the habits of someone who'd been taught that his presence was unwelcome, that his size was inherently threatening. When he left with 3 new books tucked carefully under his arm, Sarah realized something had shifted inside her. What had started as professional courtesy was becoming something more complicated, a determination to understand this misunderstood man, and perhaps to help him find his place in a world that seemed determined to reject him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the town square as Emma made her way to work, her mind still replaying yesterday's encounter with Jeremiah. She'd barely slept, alternating between worry for his safety and confusion about her own reaction to him. There had been something in his eyes when she'd spoken to him, a flicker of surprise, maybe even gratitude, that she couldn't shake. The local diner buzzed with its usual morning chatter, but today the conversation seemed more animated, more urgent. Emma caught fragments as she passed tables of coffee-drinking locals, completely destroyed the fence, sheriffs looking into it. About time someone taught that giant a lesson. Her stomach dropped. She quickened her pace toward the counter where Mabel Henderson, the town's unofficial news broadcaster, held court with her usual audience of eager listeners. 3 sections of Jim Morrison's fence just ripped clean out of the ground, Mabel was saying, her voice rich with dramatic authority. And tools scattered everywhere like a tornado hit his shed. Was anything stolen? Asked Tom Bradley, leaning forward with his coffee cup suspended halfway to his lips. That's just it, Mabel replied, lowering her voice conspiratorially. Nothing taken, just pure destruction. Jim's convinced it was that Mormon fellow. Says he's been watching his property, probably planning it for weeks. Emma's hands clenched involuntarily. Did anyone actually see him do it? The table fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Mabel's eyebrows shot up with interest. Well, no, Mabel admitted slowly. But who else could it be? Takes considerable strength to pull fence posts out of concrete, and we all know he's got a violent streak. Do we? Emma challenged, her voice steadier than she felt. Or do we just assume because he's different? Tom Bradley snorted. Different? Emma, the man's a menace. Just last month he nearly knocked down Mrs. Peterson just walking past her. She stepped backward into him, Emma corrected, remembering the incident clearly. He was walking normally on the sidewalk. She got startled and stumbled. The uncomfortable silence that followed was broken by the diner door's bell chiming. Sheriff Collins entered, his expression grim, and the entire restaurant fell quiet. "Morning, folks," he said, tipping his hat. His eyes scanned the room before settling on Mabel's table. "I suppose you've all heard about Jim Morrison's property." Murmurs of confirmation rippled through the crowd. "Well, I've got some news that might interest you," the sheriff continued, accepting a cup of coffee from the waitress. "Found boot prints in the mud near the damaged fence. Size 9, maybe 10. Work boots with a distinctive tread pattern. Emma watched the faces around her process this information. She thought of Jeremiah's enormous frame and knew without a doubt his feet would dwarf a size 10 boot. Now, that doesn't necessarily clear anyone, Sheriff Collins added carefully, but it does raise questions about our assumptions. Mabel shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Well, he could have worn different boots to throw you off. Could have, the sheriff agreed diplomatically. But seems like a lot of trouble for someone folks claim isn't too bright. The comment stung, even though Emma knew the sheriff was making a point. The way people talked about Jeremiah, like he was some kind of dangerous animal rather than a human being, made her chest tight with anger. After the sheriff left and conversations resumed their normal volume, Emma found herself walking toward the edge of town instead of to her job at the library. She told herself she was just taking a longer route, but her feet carried her past the old Morrison farm toward the wooded area where she'd heard Jeremiah had been living. She didn't expect to find him, but as she rounded a bend in the dirt path, she spotted him sitting on a fallen log beside a small creek. His massive shoulders were slumped forward, his head in his hands. Even from a distance, she could see the defeat in his posture. Her approach must have made some sound because his head jerked up, alert and wary. When he saw her, confusion flickered across his features. "I heard about the fence," she said simply, stopping a respectful distance away. His jaw tightened. "Didn't do it. I know." The words seemed to surprise him as much as they surprised her. She hadn't consciously decided she believed him, but hearing herself say it, she realized it was true. "Why?" he asked, his voice rough with something that might have been emotion. Emma considered the question seriously. "Because someone who stops to help an injured cat probably isn't the same person who destroys property for fun." His eyes widened slightly. "You saw that?" "Tuesday morning, behind Miller's grocery store." She took a small step closer, the tabby with the hurt paw. "You were very gentle." For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the small clearing. Then Jeremiah's face did something she'd never seen before. It softened, just slightly, like a door being opened the tiniest crack. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Miriam walked toward the hardware store, her heart doing an odd little flutter she couldn't quite explain. She'd spent half the night thinking about Caleb's gentle hands as he'd bandaged her cut, the way his fierce expression had melted into something almost tender when he'd seen she was hurt. The bell above the door chimed as she entered, and she found herself face to face with Harold Winters, who was leaning against the counter like he owned the place. His cronies, Pete and Earl, flanked him on either side, all three men wearing expressions that made Miriam's stomach clench. "Well, well," Harold drawled, his eyes glittering with malicious satisfaction. "If it isn't our local saint, come to visit her pet monster." "I'm here to buy gardening supplies," Miriam said evenly, though her pulse quickened. She could see Caleb through the doorway to the back room, his massive frame bent over some paperwork. He hadn't noticed her yet. "Gardening supplies," Pete repeated with a snicker. "That what they're calling it now?" Earl elbowed him, grinning. "Maybe she's planning to plant something special, something big and dangerous that don't belong in decent soil." Harold pushed off from the counter, moving closer to Miriam. She caught a whiff of stale coffee and aftershave that made her nose wrinkle. "You know, Miriam, folks are starting to talk, wondering what exactly you see in that freak back there." "I see a hard-working man who minds his own business," she replied, lifting her chin. "Maybe you should try it sometime." "Hard-working?" Harold's laugh was ugly. "You know what I heard? I heard he got kicked out of his precious church for losing his temper. Beat a man so bad they had to carry him out on a stretcher." Miriam's breath caught, but she kept her expression steady. "I don't listen to gossip, Harold." "Ain't gossip when it's true," Earl chimed in. "My cousin lives up in Salt Lake. Says everybody up there knows about Caleb Garrett. Says he nearly killed a man in a church parking lot. That's why he's hiding down here, pretending to be all reformed." The words hit Miriam like physical blows, but what hurt worse was the way Caleb appeared in the doorway at that exact moment, his face going pale as he realized what he'd walked into. His eyes met hers for just a heartbeat, and she saw something die in them. "Gentlemen," Caleb's voice was carefully controlled, but Miriam could hear the tremor underneath. "Is there something you need, or are you just here to run your mouths?" Harold's smile turned predatory. "Just having a friendly chat with Miss Miriam here, making sure she knows what kind of man she's been associating with. The kind who pays his taxes and doesn't start trouble," Caleb replied, but his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "See that?" Pete pointed at Caleb's hands. "Look how quick he gets violent. That's not natural, a man that size with that kind of temper. Get out!" Caleb's voice dropped to a dangerous rumble. "Now." Harold held up his hands in mock surrender. "Easy there, big fella. We're just exercising our right to free speech. This is still America, last I checked." Miriam watched Caleb's struggle play out across his features. The way his jaw clenched, his nostrils flared, his whole body coiled like a spring ready to snap. For a terrifying moment, she could see exactly what Harold and his friends were talking about. There was something barely contained in Caleb Garrett, something that could be truly frightening if it ever broke free. But then Caleb closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he opened them again, the moment had passed. "Please leave my store," he said quietly. Harold's expression showed disappointment that his baiting hadn't worked. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the beast to his beauty." He tipped his hat mockingly at Miriam. "You be careful now, sweetheart. Cages don't always hold." After they left, the silence in the store was deafening. Caleb wouldn't meet her eyes, instead busying himself with straightening merchandise that was already perfectly organized. "Caleb," Miriam said softly. "You should probably go," he replied without looking at her. "People are watching, they'll talk. Let them talk. You don't understand." His voice was rough with pain. "They're not wrong about me. I am dangerous. I did hurt someone. Badly." Miriam felt something crack in her chest. What happened? Finally he looked at her, and the anguish in his eyes made her want to weep. "I lost control. Someone said something about my family, about my faith, and I just snapped. Put a man in the hospital for 3 days. The church leadership said I needed to find somewhere to work on my anger, to pray and reflect. That's why I'm here." The confession hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Lily made her way to the hardware store, her mind still replaying the conversation with her sister from the night before. Sarah's warnings echoed in her head, mixing uneasily with her own growing feelings for Ezra. She'd barely slept, caught between doubt and an inexplicable certainty that everyone had gotten him wrong. The bell above the door chimed as she entered Murphy's Hardware, and she found herself face to face with exactly the kind of gossip she'd been dreading. 3 women clustered around the paint display, their voices dropping to theatrical whispers when they spotted her. "Morning, Lily," called out Mrs. Henderson, her tones syrupy with false concern. "How are you feeling, dear? We heard you had quite a scare yesterday." Lily forced a smile, knowing full well that news travelled faster than wildfire in their small town. "I'm fine, thank you. Just a little dizzy spell." "Well, thank goodness someone was there to help," chimed in Betty Rodriguez, though her expression suggested she found nothing fortunate about it at all. "Though I have to say, if it were me, I might have preferred waiting for someone else to come along." The third woman, Janet Mills, nodded sagely. "You know what they say about accepting help from strangers, especially ones with reputations." Heat rose in Lily's cheeks, but before she could respond, a familiar deep voice cut through the conversation like a knife through butter. "Ladies." All 4 women turned to see Ezra standing in the doorway, his massive frame blocking out most of the morning light. His expression was carefully neutral, but Lily caught the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested he'd heard every word. The 3 gossips scattered like startled birds, suddenly remembering urgent business in other aisles. Only Lily remained frozen in place, watching as Ezra approached the counter with measured steps. "Mr. Murphy around?" he asked Tom Murphy Jr., who'd emerged from the back room, looking distinctly uncomfortable. Yeah, he's in the office. What do you need?" Ezra placed a folded piece of paper on the counter. "Lumber order for the Thompson barn repair." Tom's eyebrows shot up. "The Thompsons hired you? Problem with that?" "No, no problem. Just surprised is all." Lily watched the exchange, noting how Ezra's jaw tightened at Tom's obvious shock. She also noticed how he carefully avoided looking in her direction, as if yesterday had never happened. "I'll get Dad," Tom mumbled, disappearing toward the office. The silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Lily fidgeted with the paint chips in her hand, acutely aware of the whispered conversations resuming in other parts of the store. "How are you feeling?" Ezra asked quietly, still not looking directly at her. "Better. Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "I never properly thanked you for yesterday. No need." His curt response stung, and she found herself studying his profile, searching for some trace of the gentleness she'd glimpsed when she'd been vulnerable and afraid. Instead, she found only the carefully constructed wall he showed the world. "Ezra, Mr. King." Tom Murphy Sr. emerged from his office with forced joviality. "Good to see you. Let's take a look at that order." The moment shattered, and Lily felt foolish for trying to bridge a gap that perhaps only existed in her imagination. She turned to leave, but Ezra's voice stopped her. "Miss Chen." She looked back to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "The paint chips," he said, nodding toward her hands. "The sage green. It would complement your garden well." Before she could respond, he turned his attention back to Mr. Murphy, effectively dismissing her. But as she walked toward the door, she caught sight of his reflection in the window display, and saw him watching her leave with something that looked almost like regret. Outside, she leaned against her car for a moment, trying to make sense of the conflicting signals. The man who'd held her so carefully yesterday seemed to have vanished, replaced by the distant stranger everyone expected him to be. Yet he'd noticed her paint choices, remembered her garden. "Lily." She turned to see Carol Jenkins hurrying across the parking lot, concern written across her features. "I heard what happened yesterday. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, really. Just got a little overheated." Carol glanced toward the hardware store, where Ezra's truck sat like a dark monument to small-town prejudice. "I also heard who helped you." Lily braced herself for another lecture, but Carol surprised her. "That was kind of him," Carol said simply. "Whatever people might think, helping someone in need takes character." As Carol walked away, Lily looked back at the store one more time. Through the window, she could see Ezra's broad shoulders as he conducted his business with quiet dignity, surrounded by whispers and sideways glances. Maybe Sarah was right to worry. Maybe she was being naive. But kindness, Lily thought, deserved kindness in return. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Ellie made her way to the hardware store, her mind still reeling from the previous evening's revelations. She'd barely slept, tossing and turning as she replayed every word of Caleb's confession about his past, the vulnerability in his voice when he'd spoken about his mistakes, the pain that flickered across his features. It had shattered every preconceived notion she'd held about the mysterious giant who'd become such an enigma to their small town. Mrs. Henderson was already stationed at her usual post by the flower shop window, her eagle eyes tracking Ellie's movement with undisguised curiosity. Ellie offered a polite wave which only seemed to intensify the older woman's scrutiny. Word traveled fast in a place like Cedar Falls, and Ellie knew her friendship with Caleb hadn't gone unnoticed. The bell above the hardware store door chimed as she entered, and her father looked up from his inventory clipboard with a mixture of concern and resignation. "Morning, sweetheart," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "You look tired." "I'm fine, Dad." She moved behind the counter, avoiding his penetrating gaze. "Just didn't sleep well." Tom Whitmore had run this store for 30 years, and in that time he'd developed an uncanny ability to read people. His daughter was no exception. He set down his clipboard and leaned against the counter. "This wouldn't have anything to do with your new friend, would it?" Ellie's hands stilled on the cash register keys. "What do you mean?" "Honey, I've seen how you light up when you talk about him, and I've also seen how the rest of this town treats him." Her father's voice was gentle but firm. "I just want you to be careful." "Careful of what?" The defensive edge in her voice surprised them both. Tom sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I'm not saying he's a bad man, Ellie, but you have to understand. People are complicated. Sometimes the stories we tell ourselves about someone don't match the reality." Before Ellie could respond, the door chimed again, and Deputy Marshal stepped inside, his uniform crisped despite the early hour. His eyes found Ellie immediately, and she noticed the way his jaw tightened slightly. "Morning, Tom." "Ellie." He nodded to each of them in turn. "I need some new hinges for the station door. Wind damage from last week's storm." As her father went to retrieve the hardware, Deputy Marshal approached the counter, his expression serious. "Ellie, can I have a word?" She glanced toward the back of the store where her father was rummaging through bins. "About what, Jake?" "About Caleb Morrison." He kept his voice low. "I know you've been spending time with him." Heat rose in Ellie's cheeks. "Is that against the law now?" "Of course not. But I care about you, and I think you should know. There have been complaints." "What kind of complaints?" Jake shifted uncomfortably. "People are nervous. His presence at the diner the other night made some folks uncomfortable. And now with you two being seen together." "We're friends," Ellie said firmly, though even as she said it, she wondered if that simple word could encompass the complex feelings that had been growing in her chest. "Are you?" Jake's brown eyes searched her face. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like more than friendship." The accusation hung in the air between them, and Ellie felt a flush of something that might have been guilt, or might have been anger. She couldn't tell which. "Even if it were more than friendship," she said slowly, "that would be my choice to make." Jake's face fell slightly. "I know that. I've seen what happens when people get involved with someone who carries that much baggage. It doesn't end well." Tom returned with a paper bag of hinges, and the conversation died abruptly. As Jake paid for his purchase, Ellie found herself studying his profile, remembering all the times he'd asked her to dinner, all the gentle overtures she'd deflected. He was a good man, stable, respected, uncomplicated, everything that Caleb wasn't. So why did the thought of safety feel so much like settling? After Jake left, the store fell into an uncomfortable quiet. Ellie busied herself with organizing the paint sample cards, her mind churning. Maybe everyone was right. Maybe she was being naive, seeing qualities in Caleb that existed more in her imagination than in reality. Maybe the smart thing would be to step back, to listen to the collective wisdom of people who'd known this town and its dynamics far longer than she had. But then she remembered the way Caleb had looked when he'd spoken about his daughter, the careful way he'd tended to the injured bird, the genuine surprise in his eyes when she'd defended him. Those moments felt real in a way that all the warnings and concerns couldn't diminish. Her father's voice broke through her thoughts. "For what it's worth, sweetheart, I've never seen you happier than you've been these past few weeks." She looked up, startled by the observation. "Just thought you should know that too," he added with a small smile. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Ezra's workshop as he carefully sanded the intricate curve of a rocking chair's arm. The rhythmic motion had become his meditation, a way to quiet the storm that had been raging in his chest since last night's dinner with Margaret and her family. The warmth in their home, the easy laughter around their table, the way Margaret's father had actually smiled when Ezra complimented his woodworking, it all felt like stepping into someone else's life. A sharp knock interrupted his thoughts. Through the window, he spotted Sheriff Davies' patrol car parked outside, and his stomach dropped. The sheriff rarely brought good news. "Morning, Ezra," Davies said when he opened the door, his expression unreadable. "Mind if I come in?" Ezra stepped aside, wiping sawdust from his hands. "What can I do for you, Sheriff?" Davies walked slowly around the workshop, taking in the half-finished furniture pieces with obvious appreciation. Beautiful work, he murmured, running his fingers along a cabinet door. My wife's been admiring the dining set you made for the Hendersons. The small talk felt ominous. Ezra waited, his jaw tight. Had an interesting conversation with Tom Bradley yesterday, Davies finally said, turning to face him. Seems he's been spreading some stories about you threatening him outside Murphy's bar last week. I never threatened him. That's what I figured. Davies leaned against the workbench. Tom's got a tendency to embellish when he's trying to save face. But here's the thing. He's got friends on the town council, and they're making noise about your business license. The words hit Ezra like a physical blow. On what grounds? Disturbing the peace. Intimidation. They're claiming you're bad for the town's image. Davies's expression darkened. It's garbage, of course, but garbage has a way of sticking around here. Ezra sank onto his work stool, the fight draining out of him. After everything, the careful rebuilding of his life, the slow progress toward something resembling acceptance, the fragile hope that had bloomed since Margaret entered his world, it was all crumbling again. How long do I have? Council meets Thursday, but Ezra, Davies stepped closer. You don't have to take this lying down. You've got friends now, people who'll speak for you. The word friends sounded foreign in relation to himself. Like who? Like Margaret Hartley, for starters. Heard she gave Tom Bradley quite the earful at the post office yesterday, something about judging books by their covers and small minds in a small town. Davies grinned. Wish I could have seen Tom's face. Despite everything, Ezra felt a warmth spread through his chest. Of course Margaret would defend him. It was exactly the kind of fierce loyalty he was learning to expect from her, even as it terrified him with its implications. There's something else, Davies continued. The Presbyterians are planning a community potluck next Saturday. Building fund or some such. Margaret specifically asked me to invite you. That's not a good idea. Why? Because some people might stare? They're going to do that anyway. At least this way you're meeting them on neutral ground instead of hiding in your workshop. The suggestion made Ezra's palms sweat. The thought of walking into a room full of townspeople, enduring their whispers and sideways glances while trying to make polite conversation over casserole dishes, seemed like a special kind of torture. Margaret thinks it would help, Davies added quietly. Show people who you really are, instead of letting them imagine the worst. Before Ezra could respond, another car pulled up outside. Through the window, he watched Margaret climb out of her sedan, smoothing her yellow sundress. She spotted Davies's car and quickened her pace, her face creased with worry. "Everything okay?" she asked breathlessly as she appeared in the doorway. Her eyes moved between the two men, clearly reading the tension. "Just having a friendly chat," Davies said easily, but he caught Ezra's eye meaningfully. "I should be getting back. Think about what we discussed, Ezra. Thursday's coming whether you're ready or not." After the sheriff left, Margaret moved closer, her hand finding Ezra's arm. What was that about? He told her everything. Tom Bradley's lies, the council meeting, the threat to his business license. With each word, he watched her expression shift from concern to outrage to something that looked remarkably like determination. "Well," she said finally, "I guess we'd better start making some phone calls. Margaret, you don't understand. This isn't your fight." She stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of her perfume, see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. When someone I care about is being treated unfairly, it absolutely becomes my fight. The simple declaration hit him harder than any of Bradley's accusations. Someone she cared about. The words echoed in the sudden silence of the workshop, heavy with possibility and promise. "Now," Margaret continued, her voice taking on a businesslike tone that somehow made her even more beautiful, "tell me everything you know about this town council." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Sarah watched Eli carefully measure ingredients for what had become their Saturday tradition, homemade bread. His massive hands worked with surprising delicacy, folding the dough with the same gentle precision he used when tending his garden. "My grandmother taught me this recipe," he said softly, not looking up from his work. She said bread made with patience always tastes better than bread made in haste. Sarah smiled, perched on the counter beside him. Over the past month, these quiet moments had become precious to her. The town still whispered, still stared when they walked down Main Street together, but somehow it mattered less each day. "Is that why you take 45 minutes to knead it when the recipe calls for 10? A rare chuckle escaped him. "Perhaps I'm overly cautious. Perhaps you just like having an excuse to stay in the kitchen with me." The tips of his ears reddened, and Sarah felt that familiar flutter in her chest. For all his imposing presence, Eli blushed like a schoolboy whenever she teased him. It was endearing in a way that made her want to protect him from the world's harsh judgments. A sharp knock at the door interrupted the peaceful moment. Eli's shoulders tensed immediately, and Sarah hopped down from the counter. Through the window she could see Martha Hendricks from the church social committee, flanked by two other women whose expressions looked anything but friendly. "I'll get it," Sarah said, but Eli was already wiping flour from his hands. "No, it's my home. I should answer." The three women on his doorstep seemed to shrink back when Eli opened the door, despite having been the ones to seek him out. Martha cleared her throat and straightened her shoulders, clearly trying to project authority. "Mr. Morrison, we need to discuss your situation." "My situation?" Eli's voice remained perfectly calm, but Sarah could see the tension in his jaw. "Your association with Miss Sarah has become quite the topic of conversation. People are concerned about the appropriateness of your relationship." Sarah stepped into view behind Eli, her temper flaring. "Appropriateness? What exactly is inappropriate about two adults spending time together?" Martha's lips pursed. "Miss Sarah, surely you understand the position this puts the community in. Mr. Morrison's reputation—" "His reputation?" Sarah's voice rose despite Eli's gentle hand on her shoulder. "You mean the reputation you've all created based on absolutely nothing? The man grows vegetables for half the town, fixes your broken fences without being asked, and has never said an unkind word to anyone, yet you treat him like a pariah because he's tall and quiet?" "There have been incidents," one of the other women piped up weakly. "What incidents?" Sarah demanded. "Name one actual thing Eli has done wrong. One real thing, not gossip or assumptions or fear based on his appearance." The women exchanged glances, and Sarah realized with satisfaction that they couldn't. There was nothing real to their suspicions, just prejudice dressed up as concern. Eli's voice cut through the tension, quiet but firm. "I appreciate your visit, ladies, but I'm afraid I don't see how my personal relationships are anyone's business but my own." "The church leadership," Martha began. "The church leadership is welcome to speak with me directly if they have concerns," Eli interrupted gently. "But I won't discuss my private life on my doorstep with a committee that wasn't invited." Sarah had never heard him be so assertive, and she felt a surge of pride. The Eli she'd first met would have simply accepted their judgment and retreated further into isolation. After the women left with their dignity somewhat bruised, Sarah turned to find Eli leaning against the closed door, looking drained. "You stood up to them," she said softly. "I'm tired of apologizing for existing," he replied, "and I'm tired of other people's fears dictating how I live my life." Sarah stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. "Good, because I'm not going anywhere, no matter what they say." Something shifted in his expression then, a wall crumbling that she hadn't even realized was still there. His hand came up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. "Sarah, He stopped, seeming to struggle with words. "What?" "I love you," he whispered, as if the admission might break something fragile between them. "I've been so afraid to say it, afraid it would scare you away." Her heart soared as she rose on her tiptoes, bringing her face closer to his. "The only thing that scares me is the thought of a life without you in it." When he kissed her, soft and sweet in the morning light, Sarah knew that whatever storms lay ahead, they would weather them together. The bread could wait. Some things were more important than patience. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah stirred pancake batter, humming softly to herself. She'd been waking up earlier these days, finding herself looking forward to breakfast preparations in a way that surprised her. The simple, domestic rhythm felt natural, comforting even, especially when she heard Ezra's heavy footsteps on the stairs. "Smells like heaven in here," he said, ducking slightly through the doorway. Even after weeks of having him around, Sarah still marveled at how he seemed to fill any room he entered. "Just pancakes," she replied, trying to keep the pleased note out of her voice. "Nothing fancy." "Nothing fancy," he repeated with a gentle smile, settling into the reinforced chair they'd picked up from the second-hand store. "Woman, you could make cardboard taste like a feast." The compliment sent warmth spreading through her chest, but before she could respond, a sharp knock echoed from the front door. They exchanged glances. Visitors were rare enough, but at 7 in the morning? Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and headed for the door, Ezra trailing behind her. Through the glass panel she could see Mrs. Henderson from the grocery store, flanked by 2 other women from town. Their expressions were anything but friendly. "Can I help you?" Sarah asked, opening the door only part way. "We need to talk," Mrs. Henderson announced, her gaze flicking nervously to Ezra's imposing figure behind Sarah. "About your situation." "My situation is just fine, thank you," Sarah replied coolly. "Sarah, honey," Mrs. Patterson from the flower shop stepped forward, her voice dripping with false concern. "We're worried about you. This man living in your house, it's not right. People are talking." "People always talk," Sarah said. "Usually about things that are none of their business." Mrs. Henderson's face flushed. "It is our business when decent folks can't walk down Main Street without feeling unsafe, when children cross the street to avoid." "To avoid what?" Ezra's voice was quiet, but it carried enough weight to make all 3 women step back. "To avoid me?" "Now see here," the third woman, whom Sarah recognized from the post office, wagged her finger at Ezra. "We know what you did. Violence like that, it's in the blood. Leopards don't change their spots." Sarah felt her temper flare. "You don't know anything about what he did or why he did it." "We know enough," Mrs. Henderson snapped. "And we know this town was peaceful before he showed up. We're here to tell you that decent people won't stand for this much longer." "Are you threatening me?" Sarah's voice dropped dangerously low. The women exchanged uncertain glances. They'd clearly expected to intimidate her, not face down her protective fury. "We're trying to help you see reason," Mrs. Patterson said weakly. "Here's some reason for you." Sarah stepped fully onto the porch, forcing the women back. "Ezra has done more good in this town in the past month than you 3 combined have managed in years. He fixed Mrs. Chen's fence for free, helped the Johnsons move their furniture when Bill threw out his back, and spent his own money on groceries for the widow Morrison." The women looked genuinely surprised by this information, which only fueled Sarah's anger. "But you wouldn't know about any of that, would you? Because you're too busy gossiping and judging to notice when someone actually helps your neighbors." "That's not the point," Mrs. Henderson began. "That's exactly the point," Sarah cut her off. "You want him gone because he makes you uncomfortable, not because he's actually done anything wrong. Well, here's a newsflash. This is my house, my life, and my choice. And I choose to trust my own judgment over your small-minded prejudice." Behind her, she felt Ezra's presence like a warm wall of support. He hadn't said another word, but she could sense his quiet gratitude. Mrs. Patterson tried one more time. "Sarah, think about your reputation." "My reputation will survive just fine. Can you say the same about yours after harassing your neighbors at 7 in the morning?" Sarah's smile was razor-sharp. "Now, if you'll excuse us, our breakfast is getting cold." She turned to go back inside, then paused. "Oh, and ladies, next time you want to express concern for my well-being, maybe try actually caring about my well-being instead of your own discomfort." The door closed with a decisive click, leaving the 3 women standing awkwardly on the porch. Through the window, Sarah watched them huddle together for a moment before retreating down the walkway, their whispered conversation animated with frustrated gestures. "You didn't have to do that," Ezra said quietly once they were gone. Sarah turned to find him watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Yes, I did. They'll make things harder for you now. Let them try." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I meant what I said out there. This is my choice." Something shifted in Ezra's eyes. Surprise, gratitude, and something deeper that made Sarah's breath catch. The pancakes could wait a few more minutes. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as Sarah walked toward the hardware store, her heart hammering against her ribs. Word had spread like wildfire through Millbrook about yesterday's confrontation at the diner. Half the town was calling her crazy for defending that giant, while the other half whispered about how maybe they'd all been wrong about Ezra Blackwood. She pushed open the heavy glass door, the familiar chime announcing her arrival. Behind the counter, old Pete Morrison looked up from his inventory ledger, his weathered face creasing into concern. "Sarah, honey, you sure you're all right? Heard there was quite the commotion yesterday." "I'm fine, Pete." She grabbed a small cart, trying to appear casual. "Just need some supplies for the library garden." As she wandered the aisles, selecting seeds and small tools, fragments of conversation drifted from other shoppers. Mrs. Chen was telling anyone who'd listen about how Ezra had helped her carry groceries to her car last week without saying a word. Tom Bradley mentioned seeing the giant man feeding stray cats behind the post office. Sarah paused by the fertilizer display, realizing something profound was happening. For the first time since Ezra had arrived in Millbrook, people were sharing positive stories about him instead of fearful speculation. The bell chimed again, and the store fell silent. Sarah looked up to see Ezra's imposing frame filling the doorway, his dark hair catching the morning light. He stood frozen for a moment, clearly unused to being the center of attention for any reason other than suspicion. Pete cleared his throat. "Morning, Ezra. What can I help you with today?" The simple greeting seemed to surprise Ezra. His deep voice rumbled softly. "Need some lumber. Fixing Mrs. Patterson's back steps." "Ah, she mentioned you'd offered to help. That's mighty kind of you." Pete's genuine warmth seemed to ease the tension in Ezra's massive shoulders. Sarah watched as her gentle giant moved through the store with careful precision, his enormous hands surprisingly delicate as he examined wood grain and tested joint stability. She'd never seen him in his element before, and there was something almost graceful about how he worked. "Sarah?" She turned to find Ezra standing nearby, his dark eyes uncertain. "I wanted to thank you for yesterday." "You don't need to thank me for telling the truth." A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Still, it meant something." Mrs. Chen approached hesitantly, clutching a small bag. "Excuse me, Mr. Blackwood. I wanted to thank you for helping me last week. My arthritis makes those grocery bags feel like boulders." Ezra's cheeks flushed pink above his beard. "It was nothing, ma'am. It wasn't nothing to me." She pressed a container into his hands. "Homemade cookies. My grandmother's recipe." Before Ezra could respond, she'd bustled away, leaving him staring at the container like it might contain precious gems. "Looks like you're collecting quite the fan club," Sarah teased, delighting in how his blush deepened. "I don't understand it," he murmured. "Yesterday, everyone was afraid of me. Maybe they just needed permission to see what was already there." Their conversation was interrupted by a crash from outside, followed by shouting. Through the window, they could see a small crowd gathering around an overturned vegetable cart. Produce rolled across the sidewalk while an elderly man sat on the ground, looking dazed. Without hesitation, Ezra dropped his lumber and strode outside. Sarah followed, watching as he knelt beside the fallen man with surprising gentleness. "Don't try to move yet, sir. Let me check if you're hurt." The man looked up at Ezra's towering form, and instead of fear, Sarah saw relief wash over his features. "Thank you, son. I think I just twisted my ankle." As if choreographed, the gathered townspeople began collecting scattered vegetables while Ezra carefully helped the man to his feet. Tom Bradley appeared with a chair from the nearby cafe, and Mrs. Chen materialized with ice wrapped in a kitchen towel. Sarah stood back, watching the scene unfold with growing amazement. Ezra had become the calm center of the rescue effort, his natural leadership and genuine care evident to everyone present. The man who'd been feared and ostracized just days ago was now the person everyone instinctively turned to for help. When the elderly vendor was safely settled and his cart righted, he grasped Ezra's enormous hand in both of his smaller ones. "God bless you, young man. I don't know what I would have done without you." As the crowd dispersed, Sarah approached Ezra, who was staring after the vendor with wonder. "Still think it's just about permission?" she asked softly. He looked down at her, his dark eyes reflecting something she'd never seen before. "Hope. Maybe you're right," he said quietly. "Maybe some hearts just take longer to find their home." Standing there on the sun-dappled sidewalk, surrounded by the gentle bustle of a town learning to see clearly, Sarah felt something shift between them, fragile and precious as morning light. The morning light filtered through Eliza's kitchen window as she packed another basket, her movements automatic after weeks of the same routine. But today felt different. The weight in her chest had lifted slightly, replaced by something that felt dangerously close to hope. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She opened it to find Mrs. Henderson from the post office, wringing her hands nervously. "Eliza, dear, I hope you don't mind me stopping by." The older woman's voice wavered. "I've been thinking about what happened at the town meeting and I owe you an apology." Eliza blinked in surprise. "Mrs. Henderson? May the first come in, please?" They settled at the kitchen table, and Mrs. Henderson fidgeted with her purse strap. "I've been talking to my Harold about everything, and he reminded me of something I'd tried to forget." She paused, gathering courage. 20 years ago, when Harold lost his job at the mill, we nearly lost everything. People talked then too, said he was lazy, unreliable. We felt so alone." Eliza remained silent, sensing the woman needed to continue. "One day I found a bag of groceries on our porch. No note, nothing. But Harold saw a tall figure walking away in the distance. We never knew for certain who it was, but—" She met Eliza's eyes. "I think it might have been Jeremiah's family. His father maybe, or even Jeremiah himself, though he would have been just a teenager." Eliza's throat tightened. "Mrs. Henderson, I let fear make me forget kindness, dear, and I'm ashamed." The woman's eyes glistened. Would you tell me how he's doing, Jeremiah?" When Eliza arrived at the cabin an hour later, she found Jeremiah splitting wood with methodical precision. Each swing of the axe seemed to release some internal tension. He'd removed his shirt despite the cool morning air, and she could see the powerful muscles of his back working beneath scarred skin. He sensed her presence and turned, immediately reaching for his shirt, but she'd already seen them, the thin white lines crisscrossing his shoulders and arms. Some looked old, others more recent. "Good morning," she said softly, pretending not to notice his quick movement to cover himself. "Morning." His voice was gruff, embarrassed. "You're early today. Mrs. Henderson came to see me." Jeremiah's jaw tensed. What did she want? Eliza set down her basket and stepped closer. "To apologize, and to thank your family for helping hers 20 years ago." He turned away, but not before she saw surprise flicker across his face. "Don't know what she's talking about." "Jeremiah." She reached out, her fingers barely brushing his arm. He flinched but didn't pull away. "Those scars, they're not all from accidents, are they?" The silence stretched between them like a held breath. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "My father, he had strong ideas about righteousness, about strength." Jeremiah's hands clenched at his sides, said the Lord tested those he loved most, that pain made men worthy. Eliza's heart shattered. "Oh, Jeremiah." I believed him for the longest time. Thought maybe if I could be perfect enough, strong enough, the testing would stop. He let out a bitter laugh, but it never did. Even after I grew bigger than him, I just took it, because he said it was God's will. Where is he now? Dead. 3 years now. Heart attack. Jeremiah's voice held no emotion. Mother followed 6 months later. Doctor said her heart just gave out, but I think she died of relief. Eliza moved to stand in front of him, forcing him to meet her eyes. What he did to you wasn't God's will. It wasn't love. It wasn't anything but a broken man hurting his child. Maybe. His voice cracked, but the whole town knew Eliza. They heard the sermons, saw the bruises I tried to hide. And they did nothing. Said it wasn't their place to interfere with a man's family. Understanding crashed over her like a wave. That's why you stay away. That's why you don't trust anyone. If God's chosen people could watch a child suffer and call it righteous, what hope is there for anything else? Eliza reached up and cupped his face in her hands, her thumbs brushing away tears he didn't seem to realize were falling. Because not everyone stayed silent. Someone left groceries for the Hendersons. Someone chopped Mrs. Patterson's firewood when she was widowed. Someone has been quietly helping this town for years, expecting nothing in return. That's different. Is it? Jeremiah, you became the man your father never was. You chose kindness over cruelty, service over selfishness. Her voice grew stronger. You chose love, even when love was denied to you. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing as if her words were both balm and blade. I'm so tired, Eliza. Tired of carrying all this anger and hurt. Then let me help you carry it, she whispered. You don't have to bear it alone anymore. The morning light filtered through Sarah's kitchen window as she stood at the stove, scrambling eggs with perhaps more vigor than necessary. 3 days had passed since Caleb's confession, and she'd replayed his words so many times they'd worn grooves in her mind like a favorite record. The vulnerability in his voice when he'd spoken about his past, the way his massive frame had seemed to shrink as he'd revealed his fears, it all made her chest tighten with an emotion she wasn't quite ready to name. A soft knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. She knew before opening it that she'd find Mrs. Henderson from next door, probably clutching some excuse for gossip in the form of borrowed sugar or a casserole dish. "Morning, dear," Mrs. Henderson chirped, her eyes bright with curiosity. "I couldn't help but notice that young man's truck in your driveway rather late the other evening." Sarah bit back a smile. In a town where everyone knew everyone else's business, 3 days was practically an eternity for news to percolate. "Caleb was helping me with some repairs," she said simply. "Oh, repairs." Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows climbed toward her hairline. "Well, I suppose he would be handy with his hands, being so large and all." Before Sarah could respond, another truck rumbled down the street, Caleb's truck. Mrs. Henderson's neck craned so fast, Sarah worried she might injure herself. "More repairs today?" the older woman asked innocently. "Something like that," Sarah replied, already moving toward the driveway. Caleb climbed out of his truck with his usual careful movements, as if constantly aware of taking up too much space. But today, something was different. He carried himself with less of that apologetic hunch, and when he spotted Mrs. Henderson watching from Sarah's porch, he actually raised his hand in greeting. "Morning, Mrs. Henderson." His deep voice carried easily across the yard. The elderly woman's mouth fell open slightly. In all the months since Caleb had arrived in town, he'd never initiated a greeting with anyone except Sarah. "Oh, good morning," she managed, then practically scurried back to her own house. Sarah couldn't suppress her grin. That was evil. "What?" Caleb's expression was perfectly innocent as he approached, though she caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. "I was being neighborly. You nearly gave her a heart attack. She's probably calling the church prayer chain right now to report that you spoke to her voluntarily. Maybe it's about time I surprised people." He paused near the porch steps, and Sarah noticed he was holding something behind his back. "Speaking of surprises," her curiosity piqued. She stepped closer. "Caleb Morrison, what are you hiding?" He brought his hands forward, revealing a small potted plant with delicate white flowers. "Apple blossoms," he said quietly. "I know it's not traditional flowers, but I thought maybe you'd like to plant it. Something that grows, you know." Sarah's breath caught. After everything she'd told him about her grandmother's garden, about wanting to create something beautiful and lasting, he'd chosen this. Not cut flowers that would wither and die, but something with roots, something with a future. "It's perfect," she whispered, accepting the pot with hands that trembled slightly. "I wasn't sure if you'd want to see me," he admitted. "After the other night, I thought maybe I'd said too much." She looked up at him, this gentle giant who'd somehow convinced an entire town he was dangerous simply by existing in a body too big for their comfort. "You said exactly enough." Relief flickered across his features. "I've been thinking about what you said, about not letting other people's fears control my life. And I realized I've been so busy trying to become invisible that I forgot I might actually want to be seen by the right person." The weight of his words settled between them, heavy with implication. Sarah felt her heart skip, then begin beating double time. "I brought coffee too," he added quickly, as if suddenly embarrassed by his boldness, "and donuts from Miller's bakery. Thought maybe we could sit on your porch, let the whole neighborhood get an eyeful." Sarah laughed, the sound bright and clear in the morning air. "Caleb Morrison, are you asking me to scandalize the good people of Cedar Falls?" "Maybe a little." His grin was sheepish but genuine. "Is that terrible of me?" "Terrible," she agreed solemnly, then ruined the effect by smiling. "I'll get plates." As she headed inside, she caught sight of movement in several windows along the street. By evening, half the town would know that Sarah Chen had spent her morning having coffee and pastries with the intimidating stranger. They'd whisper and speculate, and probably get most of the details wrong. For once, she found she didn't care. The wedding preparations had transformed the entire town into a whirlwind of activity. White ribbons adorned every lamppost on Main Street, and Mrs. Henderson had somehow convinced half the businesses to display matching bouquets in their windows. Sarah found herself caught between overwhelming gratitude and mild panic as she watched the celebration grow far beyond anything she'd imagined. "I think your friend Gladys might have invited the entire state of Utah," Ezra commented, ducking slightly as he entered the flower shop, where Sarah was attempting to finalize arrangements. Even after all these months, he still had to mind his head in most doorways. "She means well," Sarah laughed, gesturing at the towering stack of RSVP cards on the counter, "though I'm starting to wonder if we'll need to hold the reception in a stadium instead of the church hall." Ezra's expression grew thoughtful as he picked up one of the response cards. "You know, 6 months ago, most of these people crossed the street to avoid me. Now they're celebrating our wedding like it's a town holiday." "People change when they get to know the real you," Sarah said, reaching up to straighten his tie. "Though I have to admit, watching Chuck Morrison ask if you wanted to be in his bowling league was pretty surreal. Almost as surreal as Pastor Williams asking if I'd consider joining the church softball team as their secret weapon." Ezra's grin was boyish despite his imposing frame. "Apparently, my intimidation factor could be useful for more than just scaring away troublemakers." The bell above the door chimed, and Gladys bustled in carrying what appeared to be fabric samples and a determined expression. "Sarah, dear, we need to discuss the aisle runner. I know you said simple, but I found this lovely material with subtle pearl beading that would just—" She stopped mid-sentence as she noticed Ezra. "Oh, hello, Ezra. Don't you look handsome today?" The transformation in how people addressed him still caught Sarah off guard sometimes. 6 months ago, Gladys had barely been able to make eye contact with him. Now she spoke to him like he was her own son. "Thank you, Mrs. Patterson. Sarah's got me trying on my wedding clothes to make sure everything fits properly." "Very wise. A man your size can't just walk into any store and expect things to work out." Gladys spread the fabric samples across the counter with military precision. "Now, about this aisle runner." Sarah caught Ezra's eye and saw him fighting back laughter. They'd learned that the easiest way to handle Gladys's enthusiasm was to let her explain everything thoroughly before gently steering toward their actual preferences. "It's beautiful," Sarah said diplomatically, "but I think we're leaning toward something a bit more understated." "Understated." Gladys repeated the word like it left a bad taste in her mouth. "Well, I suppose. But you only get married once, and this is such a special occasion for the whole town." "The whole town?" Ezra raised an eyebrow. "Oh yes, everyone's talking about it. Martha Stevens said it's the most romantic thing she's ever seen, and she's been reading those romance novels for 40 years. A tall, dark, mysterious stranger finding love with our sweet librarian. It's like something out of a fairy tale." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. "I think people might be dramatizing things a bit." "Are they, though?" Ezra's voice was gentle, and when Sarah looked at him, his expression was serious despite the playful tone. "Because, from where I stand, it feels pretty magical." The sincerity in his words made Sarah's breath catch. Even after all this time, he still had the ability to surprise her with these moments of unexpected tenderness. Gladys clutched the fabric samples to her chest. "Oh my goodness, you two are going to make me cry right here in the flower shop. The way you look at each other, it's just beautiful." "Speaking of beautiful," Ezra said, his attention returning to Sarah, "I have something for you." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small wrapped box. An early wedding present. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped it, revealing a delicate silver locket. When she opened it, she found a tiny photo of the two of them from the town's summer festival, laughing together at something absurd that had happened during the pie-eating contest. "When did you—" she began, then stopped as she noticed the engraving on the back, "For the woman who saw everything I could become." "Ezra," she whispered, her vision blurring with tears. "I wanted you to have something that reminded you that this whole thing started because you were brave enough to see past what everyone else saw when they looked at me." Gladys had given up any pretense of not eavesdropping and was now openly dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. "Help me put it on?" Sarah asked. As Ezra's large hands carefully fastened the delicate chain around her neck, Sarah realized that sometimes the most beautiful love stories were the ones that started with someone simply choosing to look closer. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen window as Sarah hummed softly, scrambling eggs for breakfast. The past few weeks had settled into a comfortable rhythm. Ezra would arrive each morning to help with the farm work, they'd share meals together, and slowly, carefully, they'd been rebuilding what felt like the foundation of something real. The knock at her door came earlier than usual. Sarah glanced at the clock, frowning. Ezra typically didn't arrive until after 8, and it was barely 7:30. She wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Mrs. Henderson from the general store, flanked by Deacon Williams and Mayor Pritchard. "Sarah, dear," Mrs. Henderson began, her voice dripping with false concern. "We need to have a word with you." Sarah's stomach tightened, but she stepped aside to let them in. The three filed into her living room, arranging themselves like a tribunal. Mayor Pritchard cleared his throat importantly. "Miss Sarah, it's come to our attention that you've been associating with that Blackwood fellow again." "Ezra and I are friends," Sarah replied carefully, keeping her voice steady despite the warning bells clanging in her head. "Friends." Deacon Williams spoke the word like it tasted sour. "Young lady, that man is dangerous. The whole town knows what he's capable of when his temper flares." "You don't know him at all," Sarah shot back, her protective instincts flaring. "Ezra is gentle and kind." "Kind?" Mrs. Henderson's eyebrows shot up. "Sarah, honey, that man nearly killed poor Tommy Morrison in a fit of rage. He's been shunned by his own church, for heaven's sake. What does that tell you?" Sarah felt her cheeks burn. "It tells me that people are quick to judge and slow to forgive." The three exchanged meaningful looks. Mayor Pritchard leaned forward, his expression growing stern. "Sarah, we're not here to argue with you. We're here because we care about this community's well-being, and frankly, your association with Blackwood is becoming a problem." "What kind of problem?" Sarah's voice came out sharper than she intended. "The kind that affects property values," the mayor continued bluntly. "The kind that makes decent families think twice about settling here. We've already had the Weatherbys express concerns about moving their business to town." "Because of Ezra?" "Because of the both of you," Mrs. Henderson interjected. Sarah, dear, you're a respected member of this community. Your reputation matters. And when you're seen cavorting with a known violent man—" "He's not violent." Sarah stood abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. "You're talking about a man who spent his own money to fix Mrs. Coleman's roof last month. A man who found the Pattersons' lost cattle and didn't ask for a dime in return." "We're not here to debate his character," Deacon Williams said coldly. "We're here to make you an offer." Sarah's blood chilled. "What kind of offer?" Mayor Pritchard smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "The town council has been discussing your situation. We understand that running a farm alone is difficult. We're prepared to purchase your property at a very generous price, well above market value. You could start fresh somewhere new, away from unfortunate influences." The room fell silent except for the ticking of Sarah's grandmother's clock on the mantel. She stared at the three faces before her, understanding dawning like a cold sunrise. "You want to buy me out? Get rid of me because I won't turn my back on Ezra. We want what's best for everyone involved," Mrs. Henderson said sweetly. "And if I refuse?" The mayor's smile grew thinner. "Well, that would be unfortunate. You see, there are certain regulations about farm operations that haven't been strictly enforced lately. Health codes, zoning requirements, tax assessments. It would be a shame if those suddenly became pressing issues." Sarah felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, but she lifted her chin defiantly. "Are you threatening me?" "We're offering you a solution," Deacon Williams replied smoothly. "One that benefits everyone. You get a fresh start, and the community can move forward without complications." Before Sarah could respond, heavy footsteps sounded on the porch. The front door opened, and Ezra's voice called out cheerfully, "Sarah? Sorry I'm early, but I thought we could—" He stopped short when he saw the visitors, his expression immediately shifting to one of wary alertness. "Mr. Blackwood," Mayor Pritchard said coolly. "How convenient. Perhaps you should hear this as well." Ezra's eyes found Sarah's, and she saw the familiar pain creep into his features, the same look he'd worn when the whole town had first turned against him. He straightened to his full, imposing height, and Sarah watched the three visitors instinctively lean back in their chairs. "Hear what?" Ezra's voice was quiet, controlled, but Sarah could sense the tension coiled beneath the surface. "We were just explaining to Miss Sarah here that her current associations might be affecting her standing in the community," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice slightly breathless as she craned her neck to look up at him. Sarah watched Ezra's jaw tighten, saw the exact moment he began to retreat behind his walls again. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window as Sarah hummed softly, scrambling eggs for what had become their Saturday tradition. 6 months had passed since the town meeting that changed everything, and the transformation in both their lives felt nothing short of miraculous. "Something smells incredible." Ezra's deep voice rumbled from the doorway, and Sarah's heart still did that little flutter it had done since their first real conversation. He'd grown more comfortable with casual affection, wrapping his arms around her waist from behind as she cooked. "Mrs. Henderson dropped off fresh herbs yesterday," Sarah said, leaning back against his broad chest, "along with what I'm pretty sure was an interrogation disguised as neighborly concern." Ezra chuckled, the sound vibrating through his chest. "What did our town's unofficial mayor want to know this time?" "When you're going to make an honest woman of me naturally." Sarah felt him tense slightly behind her, and she quickly added, "I told her we're taking things at our own pace." They'd had this conversation before, dancing around the topic of their future with the careful consideration that had become their hallmark. Neither wanted to rush what they'd built so carefully. "Actually," Ezra said, his voice suddenly uncertain in a way that made Sarah turn in his arms, "I've been thinking about that myself." Before Sarah could respond, a sharp knock echoed through the house. They exchanged glances. It was barely 8 in the morning on a Saturday. Sarah opened the door to find a slight woman with graying hair and kind eyes, clutching a small suitcase. Behind her stood a tall, lanky young man who bore an unmistakable resemblance to Ezra. "Oh," the woman said softly, taking in Sarah's casual clothes and obvious comfort in the house. "I'm sorry, we must have the wrong address. We're looking for Ezra Montgomery." "Mom?" Ezra's voice cracked like a teenager's as he appeared behind Sarah. The reunion was awkward at first, years of hurt and misunderstanding hanging in the air like morning fog. Ezra's mother, Helen, kept glancing between her son and Sarah with poorly concealed curiosity, while his younger brother David shuffled uncomfortably by the door. "We drove all night from Salt Lake," Helen explained, settling nervously on the edge of the couch. "Your last letter mentioned you'd found some peace here, and David graduates from high school next month. I thought, well, I hoped we might talk." Sarah started to excuse herself, but Ezra's hand found hers, his grip firm. "Sarah stays," he said quietly. "She's the reason I have any peace to speak of." The next hour unfolded like a careful excavation, each family member contributing pieces to a puzzle of pain and misunderstanding. Helen spoke of her fear after Ezra's father died, how she'd leaned too heavily on church elders who insisted tough love would bring her rebellious son back into the fold. David, now 17 and more insightful than his years suggested, admitted he'd always thought the adults had gotten it wrong. "You scared people," Helen said finally, looking at her massive son with tears in her eyes. "But you were just hurting, weren't you? And instead of helping, we made it worse." Ezra's composure cracked then, and Sarah watched this man who'd been carrying the weight of rejection for so long finally let his mother see his wounds. "I never stopped wanting to come home," he whispered. "I just didn't know how." "Well," Helen said, standing with sudden determination, "maybe it's time we learned how to be a family again." Sarah slipped away to give them privacy, busying herself in the garden, while the Montgomery family rebuilt bridges that had been burned years ago. Through the window she could see animated conversation, occasional laughter, and yes, a few more tears. When she returned hours later with arms full of vegetables for dinner, she found David teaching Ezra something on his phone, while Helen examined the photographs Sarah had arranged on the mantel. Pictures of Ezra with the children from her tutoring sessions, of them at various town events, of quiet moments that captured his gentle nature. "He looks happy," Helen said simply as Sarah joined her. "He is," Sarah replied. "We both are." "Good." Helen's smile was warm and genuine. "He wrote about you in his letters, you know. How you saw past what everyone else was afraid of. How you made him remember who he really was." That evening, as they all sat around Sarah's dinner table, a table that had rarely seen more than 2 place settings in recent years, the conversation flowed easier than anyone had expected. David regaled them with stories from school, Helen shared updates about family and old neighbors, and Ezra, gradually relaxing, began to talk about his plans for the carpentry business he'd been building. "I think," Helen said as they cleared dishes, "we have a lot of lost time to make up for." Ezra caught Sarah's eye across the kitchen, and in his smile she saw gratitude, hope, and something else, a quiet certainty that made her heart race with anticipation for whatever conversation they'd been building toward before his family's surprise arrival. The morning sun filtered through the gauze curtains of Sarah's kitchen window as she hummed softly, scrambling eggs for breakfast. 6 months had passed since the trial that cleared Ezekiel's name, and the rhythm of their life together had settled into something beautiful and strange, like a melody she'd never heard before but somehow knew by heart. "You're going to burn those eggs if you keep daydreaming," Ezekiel's deep voice rumbled from behind her, his massive frame casting a gentle shadow as he wrapped his arms around her waist. "I wasn't daydreaming," she protested, leaning back against his chest. "I was plotting." "Oh, no." His laugh vibrated through her. "What kind of plotting?" Sarah turned in his arms, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "The church social committee finally asked me to organize the harvest dance. Me. Can you believe it?" Ezekiel's eyebrows shot up. The same women who had whispered behind their hands about Sarah's choice to stand by him were now seeking her leadership. "And you said yes?" "I said yes," she grinned. "And you're going to help me?" The look of pure terror that crossed his face was so comical that Sarah burst into laughter. "Ezekiel Morrison, you faced down a courtroom full of people who thought you were a murderer, but you're afraid of hanging streamers." "I'm not afraid," he said with wounded dignity. "I'm just selective about my battles." 3 hours later, they stood in the church fellowship hall, surrounded by boxes of decorations, folding chairs, and what appeared to be enough orange and gold fabric to drape the entire state of Utah. "Explain to me again why we need 17 different types of gourds," Ezekiel asked, holding up something that looked like it belonged in a Dr. Seuss book. "Because," Sarah said patiently, standing on a stepladder while trying to hang lights, "autumn is about abundance, and, oh," the ladder wobbled dangerously. Ezekiel's quick reflexes caught both Sarah and the ladder before either could fall. "Maybe I should do the high work," he suggested mildly. "You think?" Sarah laughed breathlessly, her heart racing from more than just the near fall. Even after all these months, his protective instincts could still catch her off guard. As they worked, other church members began trickling in to help. Martha Henderson arrived with her famous apple cider, followed by the Jameson family carrying boxes of homemade pumpkin bread. Even cranky old Mr. Peterson showed up with his truck full of hay bales for seating. The transformation was remarkable, not just of the hall, but of the people. Sarah watched as Mrs. Carmichael actually asked Ezekiel's opinion on table arrangements, and young Tommy Fletcher peppered him with questions about woodworking while they set up the stage for the band. "You know what this is?" Sarah murmured to him during a quiet moment. "A lot of work for one night of dancing." "Forgiveness," she said simply. "This is what forgiveness looks like when it's lived out loud." Ezekiel's hands stilled on the banner he was hanging. For a moment, his carefully constructed composure cracked, revealing the man who had spent so many years believing he was unworthy of such grace. "Hey," Sarah said softly, touching his arm. "You okay?" He nodded, then shook his head, then laughed at his own confusion. "I keep waiting for someone to remember they're supposed to hate me." "Nobody hates you, Ezekiel. They were just scared. Fear makes people do stupid things sometimes, like falling in love with the town pariah." Sarah's smile was radiant. "That wasn't stupid. That was the smartest thing I ever did." By evening, the fellowship hall had been transformed into an autumn wonderland. Golden lights twinkled overhead like stars, the scent of cinnamon and apple filled the air, and the sound of fiddle music drifted through the open doors. Ezekiel stood at the edge of the dance floor, watching couples spin and sway. His usually serious expression had been replaced by something softer, wonder maybe, or simple contentment. "Aren't you going to ask me to dance?" Sarah appeared at his elbow, radiant in a dress the color of autumn leaves. "I don't really dance," he admitted. "I don't really organize church socials, but here we are." She held out her hand. "Come on, Ezekiel, live a little." As he took her hand and led her onto the dance floor, Sarah caught sight of their reflection in the darkened windows, a giant of a man and the small woman who had changed everything, moving together like they'd been dancing their whole lives. The music swirled around them, and for the first time in either of their lives, they were exactly where they belonged. In each other's arms, surrounded by community, no longer hiding from who they were or what they meant to each other. Sometimes the most beautiful endings were really just beginnings in disguise.